The morning sun painted the Dakota hills in gold as Dakota knelt beside the rushing stream. His calloused hands cupped the cold water, bringing it to his lips in the sacred way his grandfather had taught him. Each drop was a gift from the spirits. Each sunrise a reminder that life was precious and could vanish like smoke in the wind. At 28 winters, Dakota had already earned respect among the Oglala Sioux as both a skilled hunter and fierce protector. His dark eyes held the depth of someone who had seen too much, yet his heart still burned with love for his people. The other warriors often joked that his name suited him perfectly, friend to everyone, because even in battle, he fought with honor rather than hatred. But that morning, as he performed his daily prayers by the water's edge, Dakota felt a heaviness in his chest that wouldn't lift. The sacred Black Hills, where his ancestors had walked for countless generations, were no longer safe. White settlers arrived almost daily, their wagons cutting deep scars across the prairie. Behind them came soldiers in blue uniforms, carrying promises of peace that always ended in blood. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke his meditation. Dakota rose smoothly, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. But it was only his friend Ayana, riding hard from the direction of their village. "Dakota," she called, pulling her horse to a stop. "Chief Ironcloud calls for you. The scouts have returned with troubling news." He nodded, knowing what this meant. For months, tensions had been building like storm clouds on the horizon. The white men wanted the gold they claimed lay buried in the Black Hills, land that was sacred to his people. Treaties had been signed and broken so many times that the paper meant nothing. Now, it seemed, the talking was over. As they rode back toward the village, Ayana glanced at her childhood friend with concern. "You carry the weight of winter in your eyes, brother. What troubles you?" Dakota was quiet for a long moment, watching. The familiar landmarks passed by. The old cottonwood where he'd learned to climb as a boy. The meadow where his younger brother Chayton had caught his first rabbit. Every place held memories, and every memory reminded him of what they stood to lose. "I dreamed of Chayton again last night," he finally said. "He was standing in a field of snow, calling my name. But when I tried to reach him, the snow turned to blood." Ayana's face darkened. Everyone in the village still mourned Chayton's death. He had been only 19 when cavalry soldiers attacked their winter camp, claiming they were searching for stolen horses. The boy had died trying to protect the elderly and children who couldn't flee fast enough. His body had been found 3 days later, frozen in the snow, with his arms still wrapped around an old grandmother he'd been helping to safety. "Dreams can lie, brother," Ayana said gently. "Your brother walks with the spirits now. He would want you to live, not carry his pain like a stone in your heart." The village came into view as they crested a small hill. Smoke rose from dozens of tippahs arranged in careful circles, following traditions older than memory. Children played between the lodges while women worked on winter preparations. Dogs barked and horses grazed peacefully in the distance. It looked so normal, so timeless, that for a moment Dakota could almost forget the danger pressing in from all sides, but the illusion shattered as soon as they reached Chief Ironcloud's lodge. Warriors sat in a tight circle, their faces grim. The chief himself, a man who 70 winters had bent his back but not broken his spirit, looked up as Dakota entered. "Sit, my son," Ironcloud said, gesturing to an empty space in the circle. "Swift Eagle has returned from the eastern ridges with news that will test us all." Swift Eagle, the band's best scout, stepped forward. His clothes were dusty from hard riding, and exhaustion lined his young face. "I counted more than 200 soldiers making camp near Crow Butte," he reported. "They have cannons and supply. Wagons. This is not a patrol. They come for war." A murmur ran through the gathering. 200 soldiers meant serious trouble. Their own band numbered less than 60 warriors, with many women, children, and elders who would need protection. If fighting began— "Did you see their leader?" asked Brave Wolf, one of the senior warriors. "A tall man with yellow hair on his face," Swift Eagle replied. "The soldiers called him Colonel. He wore many medals and spoke with great authority. I heard him tell his men that they would clear the savages from these hills once and for all. The words hit Dakota like a physical blow. He had heard such language before, always followed by burned villages and unmarked graves. His hand unconsciously moved to the medicine pouch around his neck, where he kept a small braid of Chayton's hair, all he had left of his brother. Chief Ironcloud raised his weathered hand for silence. We have lived on this land since the world was young. Our fathers hunted these valleys, our mothers gathered roots in these meadows. Every stream knows our songs, every hill holds our prayers. We will not be driven away like prairie dogs from their burrows. But what can 60 warriors do against 200 soldiers with cannons? Asked Little Hawk, a younger warrior whose wife had recently given birth to their first child. The chief's eyes found Dakota across the circle. Sometimes, young one, courage is not about numbers. Our ancestors faced many enemies and survived because they remembered what they fought for. We do not fight for glory or gold. We fight for the right to exist as we are, where we belong. As the council continued late into the morning, plans were made and assignments given. Dakota found himself chosen to lead a scouting party that would keep watch on the soldiers' movements. It was an honor that came with deadly responsibility. The information he gathered could mean the difference between survival and disaster for his people. When the meeting finally ended, Dakota walked alone to the edge of the village. The autumn air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, familiar smells that had always meant home and safety. Now they felt fragile, like everything else he loved. His grandmother Winona found him there, standing quietly among the aspens, whose leaves whispered secrets in the wind. At 82, she moved slowly, but with the dignity of someone who had outlived many sorrows and still found reasons to smile. "Your heart is heavy, grandson," she said, settling beside him on a fallen log. "But a heavy heart can still beat with courage." "Grandmother, I fear I am not the man this moment requires," Dakota admitted. "When I think of Chayton, anger burns in my chest like fire. I want revenge for his death, for all the deaths." "But you?" "Taught me that anger makes poor decisions." Winona nodded slowly, her ancient hands folded in her lap. "Your brother was taken from us by men who forgot that all people are children of the same earth. But if you become like them, if you let hatred guide your actions, then they have killed your spirit as well as his body." She reached into her medicine bag and pulled out a small, perfectly round stone, smooth from countless years in the river. "This was given to me by my grandmother, who received it from hers. Each woman in our family has carried it through times of great darkness. Now I give it to you." Dakota accepted the stone, feeling its weight and warmth. "What power does it hold?" "The power to remember," Winona said. "When the world grows dark and your heart fills with rage, hold this stone and remember what you truly fight for, not revenge, but protection. Not hatred, but love for what is good and sacred." As the sun reached its peak, Dakota prepared for his scouting mission. He checked his weapons, gathered supplies, and said goodbye to friends who might not survive the coming storm. But as he mounted his horse and rode toward the eastern hills where danger waited, he carried more than just bow and arrows dot in his heart. He carried the weight of his people's hopes. In his mind he held memories of his brother's laughter and his grandmother's wisdom. And in his hand he clutched the smooth river stone that had guided generations of his family through their darkest hours. The warrior's path had never been easy, but Dakota had walked it his entire life. Now, as storm clouds gathered both in the sky and in the hearts of men, he would discover that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with weapons, but with choices that define who we truly are when everything we love hangs in the balance. 3 days had passed since Dakota began watching the soldier camp from the rocky hills above. He lay flat against the cold stone, studying their movements through the early morning mist. The blue-coated men followed the same routine each day, rising at dawn, eating their strange canned food, and drilling with their weapons in neat rows. But today felt different. The soldiers moved with urgency, breaking camp faster than usual. Dakota counted the horses being saddled and the supplies being loaded onto pack mules. His stomach tightened as he realized what he was seeing. They were preparing to move toward his village. He slipped back from his hiding place and mounted his horse. riding hard through the twisted canyons that only his people knew. The autumn wind whipped his long black hair as he pushed his pony to its limits. Every minute counted now. His family, his friends, the children playing by the stream, they were all in danger. The sun climbed higher as Dakota raced across the familiar landscape. He knew these hills like the lines on his own hands, every deer trail and hidden valley. Behind him, he could hear the distant sound of many horses and the creaking of wagon wheels. The soldiers were coming, and they were coming fast. As he crested a ridge overlooking Willow Creek, where his people often hunted, Dakota spotted something that made his blood run cold. A small group of his fellow warriors had come out early to check their fishing nets, unaware of the approaching danger. Gray Wolf, Standing Bear, and young Foxtail were moving slowly along the creek bank. Their attention focused on their work. Dakota shouted a warning, his voice echoing across the valley. But it was too late. The thunder of hoofbeats filled the air as cavalry soldiers poured over the opposite ridge like angry hornets. The peaceful morning exploded into chaos. Without thinking, Dakota spurred his horse down the steep slope toward his friends. Arrows whistled past his head as he rode. The soldiers were shooting at anything that moved, their faces hard with the kind of hatred that comes from fear. Gray Wolf fell first, struck down as he tried to reach his bow. Standing Bear managed to loose 3 arrows before a cavalry saber found its mark. Young Foxtail, barely 17 winters old, tried to run but stumbled in the shallow water. Tiako reached him first, swinging his war club to drive back a soldier who was raising his pistol. The man's horse reared, giving Foxtail time to scramble to safety behind a fallen log. But more soldiers were coming, too many to fight. The sacred grove, Dakota shouted to Foxtail. Run to the sacred grove and warn the village. The boy nodded and disappeared into the thick brush like a rabbit. Dakota turned to face the approaching cavalry, his heart pounding with grief and rage. Gray Wolf and Standing Bear lay still in the bloody creek water. These had been good men, fathers and husbands who would never see their families again. A tall soldier with lieutenant's bars on his blue uniform rode toward Dakota, his saber gleaming in the morning sun. The man's face was young but set with grim determination. Behind him rode a dozen more cavalrymen, their weapons ready. "Surrender, savage," the lieutenant called out in English. "Throw down your weapons and we'll make it quick." Dakota understood enough of the white man's language to know what was being demanded. But surrender had never been in his nature. He thought of his brother Chayton, of the promise he'd made to protect his people. With a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls, he charged. The battle that followed was fierce, but brief. Dakota fought like a man possessed, his war club crushing bones and his knife finding gaps in the soldiers' defenses. But he was one against many, and gradually they began to surround him. The lieutenant stayed back, shouting orders while his men tried to close the trap. Dakota could see the fear in the young officer's eyes. This wasn't the easy victory the soldiers had expected. 3 of their number already lay wounded or dead. Sensing the trap closing, Dakota suddenly wheeled his horse and galloped toward the thick forest that bordered the creek. Bullets whistled around him as he crashed through the underbrush, low, branches tearing at his clothes and face. After him, he heard the lieutenant shout, "Don't let him escape to warn the others." The chase led deeper into the woods, where the cavalry horses struggled with the thick undergrowth and fallen logs. Dakota's smaller pony moved more easily through the obstacles, but his enemies' greater numbers were starting to tell. They were spreading out, trying to cut off his escape routes. He found himself in a narrow ravine filled with massive boulders and dense thickets. The sound of pursuing horses echoed from several directions. Dakota dismounted and sent his pony running with a slap on its flank. Better to let the faithful animal escape than have it shot down. Moving on foot now, he used every skill his father had taught him about forest warfare. He was a shadow among the trees, a ghost that appeared and vanished before the soldiers could take aim. His bow sang as arrow after arrow found its mark, evening the odds. But as the morning wore on, Dakota realized he was being driven deeper into the ravine, away from any path back to his village. The lieutenant was smarter than he'd first appeared. The man was using his superior numbers to herd Dakota like a deer toward waiting hunters. The end came suddenly. Dakota rounded a massive pine tree and found himself face to face with the young lieutenant. The officer's horse had thrown him, and he lay propped against a boulder, his right leg bent at an unnatural angle. Blood seeped through his blue uniform jacket from a wound in his shoulder. For a long moment the two enemies stared at each other across 10 feet of forest floor. The lieutenant's hand moved slowly toward his fallen pistol, but Dakota was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew his tomahawk and raised it high. This was the moment he had dreamed of since Chayton's death, a chance to strike back at the men who had brought such pain to his people. The lieutenant's eyes were wide with fear, but he faced his death with courage. Dakota could respect that. Even in an enemy, the tomahawk began its downward arc, and then a sound stopped it mid-swing. A small, frightened cry came from somewhere behind the wounded officer. Not the voice of a grown man, but something much more innocent. Dakota froze, his weapon still raised. The lieutenant followed his gaze, and his face went white with horror. "No," the officer whispered. "Please, she's just a child." From behind a pile of fallen branches crawled a little girl, perhaps 4 or 5 winters old. Her blue dress was torn and dirty, her blonde hair tangled with leaves and twigs. She had been crying, and her small face was streaked with tears and dirt. The sight hit Dakota like a physical blow. This wasn't a warrior or a soldier. This was someone's daughter, someone's precious child. Her large blue eyes looked up at him with the same terror he had seen in his own people's children when the soldiers came to their village. "Papa?" the little girl whimpered, crawling toward the wounded lieutenant. "Papa, I'm scared." The officer, her father, tried to reach for her with his good arm. "It's all right, little star," he said in a gentle voice that was nothing like the harsh commands Dakota had heard him giving his soldiers. "Papa's here. Everything will be all right." Dakota stood frozen, his tomahawk still raised but forgotten. In his mind, he saw his brother Chayton teaching a group of village children how to make toy arrows. He remembered his own childhood, feeling safe and protected in his father's strong arms. This white child, enemy though she was, deserved that same feeling of safety. The lieutenant looked up at him, no longer a soldier but simply a father fearing for his child's life. "Please," he said quietly. "She has no one else. Her mother died of fever last winter. I'm all she has in this world." The words cut deeper than any blade. Dakota thought of his grandmother Winona's teachings about the sacred nature of all children, regardless of their color or tribe. He thought of the smooth river stone in his medicine pouch and the wisdom it represented. Slowly, very slowly, Dakota lowered his tomahawk. The weight of the decision seemed to crush down on his shoulders like a fallen tree. Everything he had been taught about warfare, about revenge, about protecting his people, screamed at him to finish what he had started, but louder than all of that was the voice of his own spirit, the part of him that Chayton had loved, that his grandmother had nurtured. The part that remembered what it meant to be truly human. As distant shouts echoed through the forest, the other soldiers still searching for their missing officer, Dakota made a choice that would change everything. Instead of taking a life, he would try to save 2. The battle that had started with blood and hatred was about to become something entirely different. Something that would test everything Dakota believed about honor, mercy, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Dakota stared down at the wounded officer and his terrified daughter. Every instinct screamed at him to finish what the battle had started. This man wore the same blue uniform as the soldiers who had killed his brother. His hands had likely pulled triggers that ended innocent lives, but the little girl's soft whimpering cut through his rage like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She couldn't be more than 4 winters old, with golden hair that reminded him of prairie grass in autumn. Her small hands clutched at her father's torn jacket as she tried to understand why he wasn't standing up to protect her. "Please," the lieutenant whispered again, his voice barely audible. Blood continued to seep from his shoulder wound, and his face had gone pale from loss of blood. "Her name is Little Dove. That's what her mother called her. She doesn't understand any of this." Dakota's grip tightened on his tomahawk handle. The irony wasn't lost on him. The white man had given his daughter a name that sounded almost like something from Dakota's own people. Little Dove, in Lakota, they might have called her Wakanyela Chistina. The sound of approaching horses grew louder. The other cavalry soldiers were getting closer, following the trail of broken branches and scattered leaves that marked their lieutenant's desperate flight. Dakota had perhaps minutes before they would be discovered. He could kill both father and daughter now, quickly and silently, then disappear into the deep forest before the other soldiers arrived. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. His war party would understand. His people would call him a hero for striking down their enemies, but as he looked into the child's frightened blue eyes, Dakota saw something that shook him to his core. He saw himself at that same age, clinging to his own father after their village had been attacked by rival warriors. He remembered the terror, the confusion, the desperate need to feel safe in a world that had suddenly become dangerous. Little Dove wasn't his enemy. She was just a scared child who wanted her papa to make everything better. Dakota slowly lowered his tomahawk and tucked it back into his belt. The lieutenant's eyes widened with surprise and a flicker of hope. "You won't regret this," the officer said, struggling to sit up straighter. "I swear on my honor as a soldier and a father, you won't regret showing mercy." "Your honor?" Dakota spoke in halting English, his accent thick but his meaning clear. "Your soldiers kill children in their sleep. Where's honor in that?" The lieutenant's face flushed with shame. "Not all of us are the same. Some of us ... Some of us hate what this war has become. But we follow orders because we have families to protect, just like you do." Dakota studied the man's face, looking for signs of deception. But all he saw was exhaustion, pain, and genuine love for the small girl who had crawled into his arms. Whatever else this soldier might be, he was clearly a devoted father. "Can you walk?" Dakota asked. The lieutenant tried to put weight on his injured leg and gasped in pain. "I don't think so. My ankle might be broken, and this shoulder wound is worse than I thought." The voices of the searching soldiers were getting closer now. Dakota could make out individual words. They were calling their officer's name, asking him to respond if he could hear them. Soon they would reach this part of the ravine, making a decision that went against everything he'd been taught about warfare. Dakota knelt beside the wounded man. "I help you," he said simply. "But you must trust me." "Why?" the lieutenant asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "Why help your enemy?" Dakota looked down at Little Dove, who had stopped crying and was watching him with curious eyes. Despite her fear, there was something trusting in her expression, the way children instinctively recognize those who mean them no harm. "She is not my enemy," Dakota said, "and maybe you are not either." Working quickly, Dakota helped the lieutenant to his feet, supporting most of his weight. The man bit back groans of pain as they moved deeper into the ravine, away from the approaching voices. Little Dove walked beside them, her small hand gripping her father's trouser leg. They made slow progress through the thick underbrush. The lieutenant's injuries made stealth nearly impossible, and several times they had to stop while he fought off waves of dizziness from blood loss. Behind them, the search was getting more organized. Dakota could hear the soldiers spreading out, methodically checking every hiding place. "Over here," one of them shouted. "I found blood on these rocks." Dakota's jaw tightened. The trail they were leaving would be easy to follow. They needed a place to hide, and they needed it soon, remembering his childhood explorations of these hills. Dakota guided them toward a narrow opening between two massive boulders. Beyond it lay a small cave that he and Chayton had discovered years ago while hunting rabbits. It was barely large enough for the three of them, but it would have to do. As they squeezed through the opening, Little Dove began to whimper again. The dark cave frightened her, and she pressed close to her father's side. "It's all right, little star," the lieutenant whispered, using the same gentle nickname Dakota had heard earlier. "We're safe now. This nice man is helping us. Nice man." The word struck Dakota as strange. When was the last time anyone had called him nice? He was a warrior, a fighter, someone his enemies were supposed to fear. Yet here was this white child looking at him without hatred, seeing something in him that perhaps he'd forgotten existed, they huddled in the cave as the search continued outside. Through the small opening they could see Boots passing by and hear frustrated voices as the soldiers found no trace of their missing officer. Dakota held his breath each time someone came close to their hiding spot. Little Dove was thirsty and hungry. She hadn't eaten since early morning, and the fear and excitement had exhausted her small body. Without being asked, Dakota offered her water from his leather pouch and some dried meat from his travel pack. The little girl looked to her father for permission before accepting the food. "Thank you," the lieutenant said quietly as his daughter ate. "I don't even know your name." "Dakota," he replied simply. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison, James Morrison. And this is my daughter, the light of my life." He stroked Little Dove's hair with his good hand. "She's all I have left since my wife died." As they waited in the darkness, Morrison began to talk in low whispers. Perhaps it was the loss of blood, or maybe the strangeness of the situation, but he seemed to need to fill the silence. He told Dakota about his wife, who had died of fever while he was away on patrol. He talked about how hard it was to be both soldier and father, trying to serve his country while raising a daughter who needed him. "I never wanted to fight in this war," Morrison admitted, "but a man has to feed his family somehow. The army pays. Well, and there aren't many jobs for someone like me back east." Dakota listened, surprised to discover that his enemy had worries and fears just like his own people. This soldier missed his dead wife the same way Dakota missed his brother. He worried about his child's future the same way every parent did. As the afternoon wore on, the search gradually moved away from their hiding place. But Morrison was growing weaker, and his shoulder wound needed proper attention. Dakota faced an impossible choice. He could leave these two here and return to his village, or he could try to help them reach safety. Either decision would be dangerous. His own people would be horrified if they knew he'd spared enemy lives. The soldiers would shoot him on sight if they found him with their missing officer. Yet looking at Little Dove, who had fallen asleep curled against her father's side, Dakota knew what his heart demanded. Some choices transcend the boundaries of war. Some acts of mercy are worth any risk. As darkness began to fall over the forest, Dakota made a decision that would challenge everything he'd ever believed about honor, loyalty, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. He would help these two reach safety, even if it meant becoming an outcast among his own people. The journey ahead would test them all in ways they couldn't imagine. But sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the courage to choose compassion over revenge, understanding over hatred. In the flickering light of his small fire, Dakota began planning their escape, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges that would change all their lives forever. The journey back to Dakota's village took 3 days of careful travel through hidden paths and secret valleys. Morrison's injuries slowed them down, but Dakota had fashioned a walking stick from a sturdy oak branch, and the lieutenant's strength gradually returned. Little Dove proved to be a surprisingly good traveler, rarely complaining even when her small legs grew tired. On the morning of the 3rd day, as they approached the familiar hills that surrounded his home, Dakota felt his stomach twist with worry. He had sent Foxtail ahead with a message for Chief Ironcloud, explaining what had happened and asking for safe passage. But he knew his decision would not be welcomed by everyone. The first sign of trouble came when they crested the final ridge overlooking the village. Instead of the usual peaceful scene of morning activities, Dakota saw warriors gathered in tight groups, their voices carrying across the valley in heated discussion. Smoke rose from the council lodge, meaning the tribal leaders were in emergency session. "Stay close," Dakota told Morrison and Little Dove. "Let me do the talking." As they descended toward the village, people began to notice them. Children stopped playing to stare. Women paused in their work, whispering to each other behind their hands. Warriors reached for their weapons, their faces hard with suspicion and anger. Brave Wolf was the first to confront them directly. The older warrior stepped into their path, his hand resting on his knife handle. Behind him stood several other men Dakota had fought beside many times. "So it's true," Brave Wolf said, his voice cold as winter wind. "You bring our enemies into our sacred home." I bring a wounded man and his child who need help, Dakota replied calmly. They are under my protection. Your protection? Brave Wolf's eyes flashed with fury. You forget yourself, Dakota. You are one warrior among many. You cannot make such decisions alone. More villagers gathered around them. Dakota could see the confusion and fear in their faces. These were people who had lost friends and family to cavalry attacks. To them, Morrison's blue uniform represented everything they had suffered. Little Dove pressed closer to her father, frightened by the angry voices and hostile stares. Morrison himself stood straight despite his injuries, trying to maintain his dignity in the face of obvious danger. "Where is Grey Wolf?" called out an old woman whose son had been killed in a recent raid. "Where is Standing Bear? Did this white man's bullets not cut them down like wheat?" The accusation hit Dakota like a physical blow. He had hoped the village might not yet know about the deaths of his friends, but news traveled fast in small communities. "Yes," he said, his voice heavy with grief. "Grey Wolf and Standing Bear died as warriors, fighting to protect our people. Their sacrifice will never be forgotten. Then why do you dishonor their memory by protecting their killer?" Brave Wolf demanded. "Because this man did not kill them," Dakota replied. "I was there. I saw what happened. Lieutenant Morrison was wounded in the same battle that took our brothers' lives." An uncomfortable murmur ran through the crowd. Some faces showed doubt, others remained hard with anger. But before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through. "Detention, let them pass." Everyone turned to see Winona, Dakota's grandmother, approaching with slow but determined steps. Despite her 82 winters, she commanded respect from everyone in the village. Her words carried the weight of a lifetime's wisdom. "Grandmother," Brave Wolf said respectfully, "surely you cannot approve of this madness?" Winona's ancient eyes studied Morrison and Little Dove for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I see a wounded man who needs healing and a frightened child who needs comfort. The Great Spirit does not ask us to examine the color of skin before we show mercy, but they are our enemies," protested another warrior. "The child is no one's enemy," Winona replied sharply. "And as for the man, he is in no condition to harm anyone. Would you have us become like those who kill the helpless? Is that what our ancestors would want?" Chief Ironcloud emerged from the council lodge, his weathered face grave. The crowd parted respectfully as the elderly leader approached. Dakota's heart pounded as he waited to hear his fate. "Dakota," the chief said, his voice carefully neutral, "you have placed us all in a difficult position. The council has been debating your actions since Foxtail brought your message." "I acted as my conscience demanded, my chief," Dakota replied. "I will accept whatever judgment you see fit." Ironcloud studied the small group before him. His gaze lingered on Little Dove, who was trying to hide behind her father's legs while peeking out at the strange new world around her. "The child may stay," the chief announced. "She will be given food and shelter as befits any guest in our village. But the soldier—" He paused, and Dakota held his breath. "The soldier will be kept under guard while we decide what to do with him." It wasn't the acceptance Dakota had hoped for, but it wasn't outright rejection either. At least Morrison and Little Dove would be safe while the village debated their fate. "I will take responsibility for them both," Dakota said quickly. "No," Ironcloud replied firmly. "You have already shown poor judgment in this matter. Others will tend to their needs." The words stung, but Dakota knew better than to argue with the chief in front of the entire village. He watched as several women, led by his Aunt Ayana, gently guided Little Dove away toward the women's section of the village. The little girl looked back at her father with frightened eyes, but Morrison nodded encouragingly. "Go with the nice ladies, little star," he told her in English. "Papa will be fine." 2 warriors escorted Morrison to a small lodge on the edge of the village that was sometimes used for prisoners. It wasn't harsh treatment, but it made clear that he was not a welcome guest. As the crowd dispersed, Dakota found himself alone with his grandmother. Winona waited until the others were out of earshot before speaking. "You have stirred up a hornet's nest, grandson," she said with a slight smile. Half the village thinks you've lost your mind, and the other half wonders if you might be the wisest man among us. And what do you think, grandmother?" Winona was quiet for a moment, watching Little Dove being led away by the women. The child was crying softly for her father, but Ayana was speaking to her in soothing tones, even though they didn't share a language. "I think the spirits work in mysterious ways," Winona finally said. "Your brother Chayton had a gentle heart, despite being a fierce warrior. Perhaps some of that gentleness lives on in you." That evening, the village council met in formal session to decide the fate of their unexpected guests. Dakota was called to explain his actions, and he spoke honestly about what had happened in the forest. He told them about the battle, about Morrison's injuries, and most importantly, about Little Dove's innocent presence that had changed everything. The debate went on for hours. Some warriors argued for immediate execution, claiming that showing mercy to enemies was a sign of weakness that would encourage more attacks. Others, influenced by Winona's words and their own observations of the harmless child, suggested that perhaps this was an opportunity to show their enemies what true honor looked like. Young Foxtail, who had witnessed the original battle, supported Dakota's version of events. He testified that Morrison had been more concerned with protecting his daughter than fighting, and that his wounds were clearly from the early stages of the battle, not from any aggressive action on his part. As night wore on, the village remained divided. But something unexpected began to happen. Stories started circulating about Little Dove's behavior during her first day in the village. Despite her fear and confusion, she had smiled when one of the older women offered her food. She had tried to help gather firewood, even though her small hands could barely carry the sticks. She had even attempted to play with some of the village children, using gestures and expressions when words failed. By morning, even some of the harshest critics began to soften their positions. It was hard to maintain hatred toward a child who so clearly possessed a kind and innocent heart. The turning point came when Little Dove herself, escorted by Ayana, approached the council lodge. She couldn't understand the words being spoken inside, but she could sense the tension. In her simple, direct way, she knocked on the lodge entrance and asked to see her papa. When Chief Ironcloud emerged and saw the small girl's tear-stained face, something seemed to shift in his expression. Here was a child who had done nothing wrong, caught in a conflict she couldn't understand, missing the father who was all she had left in the world. The chief knelt down to Little Dove's level and spoke gently in English, one of the few phrases he knew. "You see Papa soon." As Dakota watched this exchange, he realized that his grandmother had been right. Sometimes the spirits work through the most unexpected messengers. A frightened child's innocent love for her father was accomplishing what hours of debate could not. It was reminding everyone involved of their shared humanity. The final decision was still to come, but already Dakota could see hearts beginning to change. The real test would be whether that change would be enough to overcome generations of mistrust and hatred. 2 weeks had passed since Morrison and Little Dove arrived in the village, and the autumn air carried the first hints of coming winter. The initial anger had cooled into something more complex, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and gradual acceptance. That surprised everyone. Little Dove had become the village's unofficial ambassador of peace. Despite speaking no Lakota, she had somehow learned to communicate with gestures, smiles, and the universal language of childhood play. The village children, initially shy around the strange blonde girl, now included her in their games. She helped tend the cooking fires, gathered berries with the women, and even tried to braid grass in the traditional way. Morrison, still weak from his injuries but growing stronger each day, had proven to be a respectful guest. He helped with simple tasks around the village, using his knowledge of horses to assist with the autumn roundup. More importantly, he had shared stories about his late wife and their life before the war, humanizing himself in the eyes of people who had only seen soldiers as faceless enemies. But Dakota knew this fragile peace couldn't last forever. Army patrols had been spotted in the distance, searching for their missing officer. Winter was approaching, and the village would soon need to move to their protected valley. Decisions had to be made. The answer came on a crisp morning when Fox Tail galloped into camp with urgent news. He had been watching the soldier camps from the eastern ridges when he saw something that changed everything. "A large patrol is coming," he reported to Chief Ironcloud. "Maybe 40 soldiers with their colonel leading them. They carry a white flag, but they are heavily armed." Ironcloud's weathered face grew grave. A white flag meant they wanted to talk, but 40 armed men meant they were prepared for war if talking failed. "How far?" the chief asked. "They will reach our borders by midday," Foxtail replied. Dakota felt his stomach tighten. He had always known this moment would come, but he wasn't ready for it. Neither was Little Dove, who was at that moment helping his Aunt Ayana prepare the morning meal. Laughing at something one of the other children had done, the village council convened immediately. The debate was swift but intense. Some wanted to hide Morrison and Little Dove, denying any knowledge of the missing soldiers. Others argued for handing them over immediately to avoid conflict. A few suggested fighting, though everyone knew 40 soldiers would be too many to defeat. It was Winona who suggested the third option, the one that no one else had considered. "We return them ourselves," she said simply. "Under our own terms, with our own honor." "What do you mean, grandmother?" asked brave Volf. The old woman's eyes were bright with an idea that seemed to come from deep wisdom. "We arrange a meeting. A formal exchange. We show these soldiers that we are not savages who steal children, but people of honor who protect the innocent." Chief Ironcloud considered this carefully. "It is dangerous. They might see it as a trick." "Everything is dangerous now," Winona replied. "But this way, we control how the story is told. We show them who we really are." As the council debated, Dakota found himself walking to the lodge where Morrison was staying. The lieutenant was sitting outside, watching his daughter play with the village children. Despite everything, the man looked more at peace than he had since Dakota first found him wounded in the forest. "They're coming for you," Dakota said quietly in English. Morrison nodded. He had been expecting this. "How many?" 40 soldiers. "With their colonel." Morrison was quiet for a moment, watching Little Dove as she tried to teach the village children an English song. "What will happen to me?" "That depends," Dakota replied. "My people want to return you with honor, but your soldiers, will they see honor, or will they see only enemies?" "I don't know," Morrison admitted. "Some of the men in my unit are good people, just trying to do their job and get home to their families. But others, he shook his head. Others have seen too much violence. They've forgotten that your people are human beings just like us." That afternoon, the formal arrangements were made. Chief Ironcloud sent Foxtail with a message to the approaching cavalry. They would meet at sunset in the sacred grove between the two camps, neutral ground that both sides could respect. Morrison and Little Dove would be returned safely, but the meeting would be conducted with dignity on both sides. As the sun began to sink toward the western hills, a small procession left the village. Chief Ironcloud led the way, flanked by his most trusted warriors. Dakota walked beside Morrison, who carried Little Dove in his arms. The little girl didn't fully understand what was happening, but she sensed the solemnity of the moment. Winona had insisted on coming too, despite her age. "This is women's business as much as men's," she had declared. "That child needs to see that not all partings are filled with hatred." The sacred grove was a circular clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees. It had been a place of peace for generations, where different tribes had met to trade and settle disputes. Now it would witness something entirely new. The cavalry was already waiting when they arrived. 40 soldiers in blue uniforms sat mounted in perfect formation, their weapons visible but not drawn. At their head rode a tall man with gray hair and stern eyes. The Colonel Foxtail had mentioned, but it was the reaction of the soldiers that surprised Dakota most. Instead of the aggressive posture he had expected, many of them looked shocked and confused. They had clearly been told they were rescuing their officer from savage captors, but Morrison looked healthy and well cared for. Little Dove was clean, fed, and apparently unharmed. Colonel Henderson, as he introduced himself, dismounted and approached the group. His hand rested on his saber, but his voice was carefully respectful. "Chief Ironcloud, I presume?" I am Colonel James Henderson, United States Army. I believe you have something that belongs to us? We have a man and child who are under our protection, Ironclad replied in careful English. We return them freely, as people of honor do. Henderson's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he suspected some trick. But then Morrison stepped forward. Sir, the lieutenant said, saluting despite his injured arm. I must report that these people saved my life and treated my daughter with great kindness. They are not our enemies, they are people of honor. A murmur ran through the cavalry ranks. This wasn't the story they had expected to hear. Little Dove, who had been quiet during the formal exchanges, suddenly broke away from her father and ran to Dakota. She wrapped her small arms around his legs and looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said in her clear, high voice that carried across the grove. Thank you for helping Papa. The simple words, spoken by an innocent child, had more impact than any formal speech could have managed. Even the hardest soldiers seemed moved by the sight of this little girl showing genuine affection for the warrior, who could have killed them both. Dakota knelt down to Little Dove's level and reached into his medicine pouch. He pulled out a small carving he had made during her stay in the village, a wooden horse no bigger than his thumb, crafted with the patience and skill his grandfather had taught him. For you to remember, he said softly, placing the carving. In her small hands, Little Dove clutched the gift to her chest and impulsively kissed Dakota's cheek. The gesture was so natural, so free of the hatred that had defined the relationship between their peoples, that it seemed to cast a spell over the entire gathering. Colonel Henderson cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion of the moment. Lieutenant Morrison, are you able to travel? Yes, sir, Morrison replied. But then he did something that surprised everyone. He stepped forward and offered his hand to Chief Ironclad. Thank you, he said simply, for showing mercy when you had every reason for revenge. I will not forget this kindness. The old chief studied the offered hand for a moment, then clasped it firmly. We are not enemies by choice, he said. Perhaps someday our children will understand this better than we do. As the cavalry prepared to leave, Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out 2 items. The first was his military compass, its brass surface gleaming in the fading sunlight. The second was a small silver locket. I want you to have these, he said to Dakota. The compass belonged to my father, and the locket contains the only picture I have of my wife. They're the most valuable things I own. I give them to you as a token of trust between us. Dakota accepted the gifts with grave ceremony, understanding their significance. In return, he gave Morrison the smooth river stone that his grandmother had passed down through generations of their family. This will remind you, Dakota said, that even in the darkest times, there are those who choose peace over war. As the soldiers rode away into the gathering dusk, Little Dove waved from her father's saddle until the village was out of sight. Dakota stood watching until the last horse disappeared over the ridge. Years passed, and the Indian Wars eventually ended, as all wars must. The old ways faded, and both peoples learned to live in a world that had changed forever. But the story of the Sioux warrior who chose mercy over revenge became legend among both peoples. Little Dove grew up to become a teacher, traveling throughout the Dakota Territory to establish schools for both white and Native American children. She never forgot the wooden horse or the man who had shown her that enemies could choose to become friends.